Okay, good. Chavra, it's wonderful to see everybody. We're going to put this link on the thing. Then we'll send out the links on the chat to everybody. So we got here. It should work. And okay, Rabbi Sai, we spent a little bit of time in the last few weeks talking about the Arba Malchios. Just to recap for a moment, just as a launching point for what we're going to speak about tonight, because Hanukkah is coming. The pasuk says at the very beginning of Bereshit, or almost at the very beginning of Bereshit, "Va'aretz hayisat tov v'avoy v'choshech al pnei ta'im v'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim." And the Medrash Rabbah quotes from Rish Lakish. This is in a number of different midrashim. To a certain extent, any time that in Sefer Bereshit you ever get anything with four, you're going to end up talking about the Arba Malchos. It's not just in Bereshit; it's kimat throughout Kol HaTorah Kula. Whenever anything is listed in fours, it is connected the Arba Malchos. And this you'll see in Sfarim goes l'chol arech haderech. It goes backwards, forwards, up and down, to the extent that Shem Hashem, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, is also connected the Arba Malchos. You see this in throughout the Sfarim, but specifically at the very beginning of Bereshit, the pasuk tells us va'aretz hayisat tov v'avoy v'choshech b'nei ta'im. Says the Medrash Rabbah, quoting from Rish Lakish, va'aretz hayisat tohu. What does tohu mean? Tohu means Bavel. That's Babylonia. Boihu, boihu zu malchus Madai. That is the malchus of Madai, Paras Madai, the Persian Medes. V'choshech, what's choshech? Yavan. Choshech is Yavan. Says the Medrash, giving a raya for each of these, a proof for everything. Choshech al pnei ta'im. Well, ta'im is malchus harisha. We're going to speak about that in a little bit. V'choshech zu malchus Yavan. This is the malchus of the Greeks. Shechshicha einem shel Yisrael b'gezeroi sehem, that they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people with their gezeros. Hayisa emeres lahem, they would say to them, Kisvu al keren hashar she'ein lachem chelik be'elokei Yisrael. Inscribe on the horn of the ox that you have no chelik, you have no portion in the God of the Jewish people. Which is interesting because as opposed to Tohu and Bo, where the Medrash gives psukim to indicate that Tohu is Bavel, the pasuk says, "V'ra'isi esa artz v'nei Tohu." I saw the land; it was desolate. Talking about Bavel, pasuk in Yirmiyahu, and the pasuk of Esther. Boihu is Paras Madai. Vayavhilu lahavia saman. They were scurrying. They were harrowed to bring Haman. When it comes to the last two, but at the very least for our purposes, for Yavan, the reason that Chazal know that Choshech means Yavan is shechshichu eneim shel Yisrael b'gzeresem. They darkened the eyes of the Jews with the gzeros. It's a very strange phrase. What does that mean, that they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people? So confuses both, right? To is meaning that there's a darkness that descends on the world with Yavan. And specifically through the gzeros issued against the Jewish people, that's where the choshech, that this darkness is felt. Now we spoke about, a few weeks ago, we spoke about this, you said that we saw in Reb Tzadok, and then we also saw in Ishbitzer, and we saw in the Beis Yankov, that each of the Arba Malchos relate to a different midah, or a different aspiration, that the Navi speaks about the Haftarah at the end of the end of the Haftarah for fast days. Al Yisrael Chacham b'Chachmasai, v'Al Yisrael Asher b'Ashrei, v'Al Yisrael Gvura b'Gvurasai, ki b'Zayis Yisrael Misalel Haskel v'Yadoisi. Al Yisrael Chacham b'Chachmasai, that a Chacham shouldn't be praising themselves based on their Chachma. So the Ishbitzer says that that's Yavan. Yavan is the Malchus of Chachma. Bavel was the Malchus of Gvura, strength. Parasma Madai, the Malchus of Osher, of Ashirus. And all three of those things ultimately flow into the Malchus HaRishon, the Malchus of Edom, or Edom, Yishmael, Esav, Amalek, which we more or less experience at the end of time, which is not for our purposes tonight. Maybe after Hanukkah we'll talk about that a little bit more. But for our purposes, specifically the world of Yavan is the one that we are about to celebrate defeating in Hanukkah. And that means that the defeat that we are going to be celebrating is that they darken the eyes of the Jewish people with their gzeros, with their decrees. Somehow or another, through the chachma of Yavan, the wisdom of Greece, and the gzeros that they enacted as a result of that wisdom, that there was a darkness that descended upon the Jewish people that needed to be defeated.
They were restrictive against the oral Torah?
They were restrictive against a lot of things.
Was that one of them? That they were fine with the regular?
Not quite. Meaning they didn't let people do bris milas, and they didn't let people learn Torah, and they didn't want us to worship Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash. So a lot of that's their races, right? It's true that the story of Hanukkah is deeply connected to the world of Torah Sheba'al Peh. We spoke a little bit about the Shabbos afternoon, but there are scant few early sources that we have talking about, even in the world of the Rishonim, that detail the story of Hanukkah. I mean, the Rambam in Hilchos Hanukkah has to tell you the whole story of Hanukkah, because it's not really written anywhere else. You have it in the book of Maccabees, which is somewhat apocryphal, meaning it's not canonized. The Gemara Masechah Shabbos gives you a little bit of the story, but the majority of the story that we have is really from Megillas Taanis, which was probably the earliest source written down in Torah Sheba'al Peh Bichlal. The first thing that was ever written down in Torah Sheba'al Peh was Megillas Taanis. Megillas Taanis was a calendar that were written before the time of the Tanaim, like a little bit before the time of the Tanaim. We're talking probably 150 BCE. Megillas Taanis was a calendar of days that you're not allowed to have a tainus. You're not allowed to fast on those days. That was Megillas Taanis. In the second Beis Hamikdash, there are days that were forbidden to have a tainus on, because these were days that were celebratory in the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. So the day that they came back to Eretz Yisrael, and the day that they rebuilt the walls, and you have a whole list. There was like dozens of days that they didn't have Tanias. The only two that we still have remaining today, the only 2 days that we have, or the only 2 events that we still have remaining from the Megillas Taanis, where it's also to have a Taanis today, are Chanukah and Purim. Right? Chanukah and Purim are the only 2 days after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash that the Tanaim insisted that we still keep these 2 days. Which, let's just put this into context. The Jewish people came back from Bavel. They rebuilt the second Beis Hamikdash. Not a lot of the Jewish people came back from Bavel. How much came back? 57,000 people total, meaning less than 10%. Less than 10% came back from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. And the people that came back were not like Chashav Yid. They weren't people that were super special. Like they weren't the big business people. They weren't the big Talmidei Chachamim. The people that came back to Bavel, from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, were the people that either were Kohanim Leviim, because that was spitz for them. Meaning, in Bavel they didn't get Trumas and Maasros. So the benefit of being a Kohen, the benefit of being a Levi was lost in Bavel. So a lot of Kohanim and Leviim came back. You had a couple of idealists, scant few idealists that came back with Ezra and Nehemiah. But the rest of the Chevra that came were people that were, for lack of a better term, were losers in Bavel. They were people that did not have good mishpachas, they didn't have good yichus. They had all sorts of weird marriages and intermarriages and weird conversions that weren't done properly, or that were done properly, or multiple generations that were confusing. And then you had all sorts of inappropriate marriages, people that were Kohanim that got married to divorcees, and all sorts of stories. And then you had people that were paupers that had nothing to eat. They figured they'd come back to Eretz Yisrael. At least there they'll get Meiser Ani. There's a little bit of social welfare. That was the Chevra that came back. The Mishnah at the beginning of Asara Yuchsin, Perk in Mesachas Kiddushin, tells us that there were 10 different madrigas of Yichus that came back from Babel to Eretz Yisrael with Ezra. Asara Yuchsin, there were all sorts of Chevra. Ezra, you feel bad for the guy. Ezra led a massive Kiruv movement, where effectively he taught people Torah Shebechsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh in ways that people just were not familiar with them. They just didn't know the halachas. The people that he was talking to were people that didn't know halacha. Mamish didn't know halacha. To the extent that the Navi writes, I think we learned this around Rosh Hashanah time. There was a Rosh Hashanah that the first Rosh Hashanah, after the people came back. Where is this? The first Rosh Hashanah, it's at the beginning of Nehemiah. They came back, they built the second Beis HaMikdash. And it's at after Ezra. And everybody swears. They start building the wall. They finish building the wall. A little bit later, I don't remember what this is. Maybe is it Yud? Yeah. Perchas. Pasuk says like this. The very first Rosh Hashanah that they built the second Beis HaMikdash. That the seventh month, the month of Tishrei, right, from Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, then Tishrei is the Chodesh HaShvi'i. Uvnei Yisrael Ba'areihem, and the Jewish people were in their cities. Vayasfu kol ha'am ki'ish echad, and everybody gathered together. El ha'rechov asher lifnei shar hamayim, to the street that was in front of the water gate. Vayomru le'Ezra Sefer lahavi Sefer Torah Moshe asher tziva Hashem Yisrael, and they said to Ezra to bring the Sefer Torah. Vayavi Ezra hakenas haTorah lifnei hakahal mi'ish v'ad isha v'chol mevin lishmaya. He brought it in front of men and women, and all those who could listen with understanding. Meaning most people couldn't listen with understanding. Right? The majority of people couldn't understand, meaning they could understand the Hebrew, but they didn't know what it meant. And you'll see what that means in a moment. Lishmai b'yom echad l'chodesh hashvi, on the first day of the seventh month, which is Rosh Hashanah. That's the first Rosh Hashanah. Vayikra b'lifnei harachav asher lifnei shar hamayim min ha'or ad machzis hayom. Neged anashim ve'hamevinim ve'oznei kol ha'am el sefer ha'Torah. He read to them from the morning until midday. He was just reading Chumash, explaining Chumash to them. These people, they were just unfamiliar with what was going on. And once they had read through a lot, look at that, Baruch Hashem. Once they had read through a lot, you see something interesting. Vayikru b'sefer Torah Elokim mefarash v'soim seichel v'yavinu b'mikra, which Chazal derish a lot on that pasuk. They have a lot to say on the pasuk. They understood what was going on in the Torah. V'soim seichel v'yavinu b'mikra. Vayomer Nehemiah. So then Nehemiah and Ezra explained to them, L'chol ha'am, to all the people that were there, Hayom kadosh hu la'Hashem Elokeichem. Today is a day that is kadosh, that is sanctified, that is elevated, transcended for Hashem. Al tis'ablu va'al tivchu. Do not mourn and do not cry. Ki boichin kol ha'am, because everybody was crying. Keshamam is divrei Torah. when they heard the words of the Torah. Why were they crying?
It was their first hearing of the Torah. It was almost like maybe like they were getting the Torah, the feeling of that.
Okay, but why they crying? There were some people that could understand the Hebrew, that had read, but everybody gathers together and they start crying. And they said, don't cry. Why? Why? Because today is a special day. Vayomer lahem, he says to them, L'chu ichlu mashman mushtu mamzakim. Go and eat fatty food and drink nice wines. Give gifts to those that don't have, meaning distribute food to the people that don't have. Because today is a special day to Hashem. Do not be depressed. Today is a day that it's a special day for Hashem. And Hashem is your source of strength. Why were they crying?
I heard from the reading that they were sinful.
They were sinful, maybe. But what did Ezra learn for them? What did he learn for them? He was reading a lot. He was reading a lot. Why were they crying that day? So the Gra says a brilliant chiddush in this. Says the Vilna Gaon, I'll tell you why they were crying. Because what Ezra read to them was the Kriyas HaTorah for that day. What's the Kriyas HaTorah for Rosh Hashanah? So today we learn from Parshas Vayera, we read the story of Akedas Yitzchak. But the pasuk says specifically about Rosh Hashanah. What's Rosh Hashanah called in the Torah? Yom Teruah. What does Teruah mean? What does Teruah mean?
Broken.
Means broken, right? Means broken. So the Gemara has machlekes what the sound of a Teruah is in the shofar. Either it's Gnuche Ganach or Yilul Yol, meaning it's either what we call a Shvarim or what we call a Teruah. It's either a groaning sound or a wailing sound. Says the Gra, when they heard the Chumash, they heard Yom Teruah Yelachem. It's a day of Teruah, it's a day of brokenness. So they're like, we have to cry. That's why they were crying. Because they didn't know what the pasuk meant. These were chevra that didn't know that Yom Teruah means you have to blow the shofar. It's a shofar Teruah. And that there's a tekiah and there's a shvarim, there's a Teruah, a tekiah. They didn't know the halachas.
They were crying because they were self-aware that they didn't know.
No, they were crying because they thought that is what the Torah had asked them to do.
Oh, so it was a grammatical or interpretive mistake.
Right, meaning the Torah Shebechsav says it's a day of Teruah, of brokenness.
And so
They felt that they should cry.
symbolize.
Right.
Okay.
Meaning that's the correct thing, that we should cry and we should wail and we should moan. Meaning Ezra read the pasuk, he says Yom Teruah Yelachem, and then he probably said the Torah Shebal Peh. He says there's two ways of understanding what the word Teruah means. Either it means Genuche Ganach or it means Yilul Yolam. Either it means groaning or it means moaning. And they said, well, I guess we have to do both. So they started crying. They started wailing. They said, no. That's what you do with a shofar. And there's a tekiah, and then Teruah, and then another tekiah, but it's a Yom Tov, and you should celebrate. They had no idea. You're talking to people that mamish had no clue. These were the people that came back and built the second Beis HaMikdash. These were the Chavra. This was the Chavra of the second Beis HaMikdash. Ezra had a hard time. He had like the hardest rabbinate in the history of the rabbinate. Ezra had a very tough time.
The chain of transmission was wholly and solely maintained by Ezra and Nehemiah?
No, there were tons of people that learned, but they were still in Bavel.
Okay.
The people that came back with Ezra were losers. They were people that didn't know, they didn't learn, they didn't have education, didn't have money.
They were the ones who could back up and leave.
Right.
They didn't have enough established back.
Correct. There are two kinds of
Your
people.
typical, kind of
There are two kinds of people that move from place to place, right? Either the people that are wealthy enough to move, the people that are poor enough to move.
I'm getting distinct Jamestown impression.
100%.
History
That's
there.
what happens.
Wow.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
The middle class, which is really the mainstay of any society, has a lot to lose by going.
Mhm.
Anytime you go anywhere, right? The people that are wealthy enough that it's not a risk, because if it doesn't work out, we can always move again. Or the people that are poor enough to say, well, it's not working out here. Maybe I can't be worse off by going there.
Without any intent of scandal, a question that I have is there any kind of tracking of that onto American Jews who make Aliyah? I'm asking
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
because I know that there's a strong sentiment of many people want to feel like they have enough money to make it over.
Yes.
there. Is there that other end of the spectrum as well, or is that
So
not
the
tracking?
answer to that is yes, absolutely. There has been a major push for people to make Aliyah for the last 75 years, but Aliyah kind of ramps up in countries where the country is destabilizing. So Russian Aliyah right now is kind of a big thing, right? Meaning, and Ukrainian Aliyah for the last 2 years, and French Aliyah for the last decade. Meaning, when things get bad, people make. South African Aliyah has been pretty strong
Mhm.
for the last probably 40 years, but at times of like the most upheaval in South Africa, those are the years that you see many more people making Aliyah. Last year, there was a tremendous amount of American Aliyah,
Mhm.
meaning as anti-Semitism was rising in campuses, and as the election seemed like it could destabilize safety and security of American Jews, many people packed up. Meaning people that were on the fence were saying, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. I'm thinking maybe there's an event that like pushes people over that tipping point. That's it. So to a certain extent, yes, you are very much correct. And to a very significant extent, the Jewish community of Bavel never actually came back. They never did en masse leave Bavel. The Babylonian Jewish community lasted from the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash.
Like 1948.
Well, really, in its heyday until about the year 900, 950.
Oh.
You're talking more than 1,500 years of a very prominent Babylonian Jewish community. Meaning, you have the period of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, all the way into the era of the late Gaonim. We're talking like the mid-900s, where that community starts to fall apart and where you start to see the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide. Because Bavel as a whole starts like falling apart. So Parnassa, people start moving around. But practically speaking, we got to this because as the second Beis Hamikdash started being built and people started getting excited about it and things were happening and things were looking good, so they made different Yom Tovim. They made Yom Tovs all throughout the second Beis Hamikdash period. Like today's a Yom Tov. They declared Yom Tovs. There were many Yom Tovs, and that's what the Megillah Tanish writes. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples.
And they've just faded away.
They faded away when the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. We'll give a couple of examples. The Megillah Tanya says the 8th day of Nisan. From the 8th day of Nisan, there was an Isser Tainus, because from the 8th day of Nisan until the end of Shavuos, they restored the practice they prepared for and restored the practice of the Korban HaOmer. And on the 23rd day of the month of Iyar, the people from Akko arrived in Yerushalayim, or they left Akko to get to Yerushalayim. And that was the Yom Tov, meaning the 17th day of Sivan. They reconquered Migdal Shur. The 15th and 16th day of Sivan, Beit She'an and Emek Yisrael they got to Yerushalayim. I mean, all of these Yom Tovim that you have, 24th day of the month of Av, they returned to there's a lot to explain. They returned to our former din, meaning they reestablished the court. So, meaning all of these Yom Tovim, the only things that we still have today are Chanukah and Purim, which is now interesting. Because it means that after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, those questions arose. Do we still observe Hanukkah and do we still observe Purim? Now, Purim, you don't have a choice. You have to still observe Purim. Why do you still have to observe Purim?
Also says Lo Yamushu, Purim stays. Right?
Purim stays. Kizvun L'Doros, right? Esther Malka says, write me for all generations. Yeah, establish that for all generations. So, and the Gemara spends a lot of time figuring out, like, how do you know that you can institute this Yom Tov called Purim? How do you know you could institute it? And they needed it. This is the Ramban in Parashat Shoftim. The Ramban in Parashat Shoftim says a devastating statement. So we're not going to do the whole Ramban now, but it's kedai to know. Remind me closer to Purim. We'll talk about it. The Ramban says there's an Isser. There's an Isser in the Torah for a Navi to be Mechadesh Davar. A Navi is not allowed to introduce a new halacha. A prophet is not allowed to say, this is the halacha. You can have what's called the Hara Shah. A Navi is allowed to say, you can do this now. But a prophet is not allowed to introduce a new detail in the Torah because there are only 613 mitzvahs, no more and no less. And a prophet is allowed to come along and say, Hashem told me that you have to do this at this point in time. But to establish a new rule for all future generations, rabbis have the authority to do this, in theory, but prophets do not. Because lo b'shamayim here, after the Torah is given, so Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Torah 613 mitzvahs, Hashem Torah tziva lanu Moshe. What's the gematria of Torah? It's not 613,
That broken, I guess.
right?
That was obvious.
It's not 613. What is it?
11.
611. 611. Why Torah tziva lanu Moshe Rabbeinu taught us Torah? He taught us 611 mitzvahs. Where's the other two?
Then there will be nothing after Moshe.
No, the first two we heard from Hashem directly. Everybody heard the first two. Until we said to Moshe, we can't handle hearing more. So,
What were the first?
Anoch Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, and you will have no other gods before me. Those two we all heard directly from Hashem, and then everybody was like, "Whoa, we can't handle this anymore." Moshe, can you please tell us the rest? So Moshe explained the rest of the Torah to us. So Torah tziva lanu Moshe, but up until that point in time, meaning until the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, we have Torah. After that, Nevi'im are not allowed to introduce Torah. They can define a halacha, they can explain a halacha, they can tell you to do something against the halacha as a one-time event, as a Hara Shah. And the Rambam writes this in Yesodei HaTorah, that this was like Eliyahu and Har HaKarmel, when the prophets of Baal and Elijah had the showdown on Mount Carmel. So then, at that point in time, Eliyahu says, "We're going to bring a korban. We're going to have a sacrifice outside of the Beis Hamikdash." Now, that's a violation of the Torah. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to have a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Eliyahu says, Hara Shah. This is what Hashem wants you to do. So, okay. So a Navi is allowed to institute a one-time violation of the Torah. The Navi is allowed to say, this Shabbos, we're breaking Shabbos. That's okay. To say, and we're not keeping Shabbos anymore. So if they would be a bona fide, verified Navi that would tell you that, we would take them to the Sanhedrin and stone them. Right? Meaning that's impossible. Yeah, that's a Navi Sheker. A Navi is not allowed to tell you to that the Torah has changed. Says the Ramban, when Esther says, Kizvun L'Doros, that I want my Yom Tov to be instituted for all generations, she was a prophet. This was a high-stakes game. If the Sanhedrin did not accept her ruling based on Torah Sheba'al Peh, they would have had to execute her. Meaning, when Esther says, I want this in the books, and that's why the Gemara Megillah has to explain, how do you know that you can have an additional commemoration of the fall of Amalek? The Gemara Darshan has to figure out in the Psukim and the Chumash how you know that you can have an additional commemoration. That this is not a violation, it's not an addition to 613 mitzvahs, this is part of one of the 613 mitzvahs called Zachar Asher Asalacha Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you, that this is part of that remembrance of what Amalek did to you. It is a part of the Din D'Oraisa. It's part of that biblical imperative. Were it not to be for that, Esther would have been in big trouble. Esther and Mordechai. But that notwithstanding, that's how we know that Purim, they couldn't get rid of Purim. Because you have that Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh, written Torah, oral Torah, both tell you have to observe Purim. Hanukkah is interesting.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
you raised the interesting issue, but I don't think you answered it. How did they know
How did they know what?
that it was okay for Esther to declare?
Because
it fell within that?
Yeah, because they pulled it out of the psukim. Meaning they found a way of understanding within the psukim in the Torah that this is what Hashem wanted.
Was it solely just the remember not to forget what Amalek did to you thing, or was it something to say, and that's how we know this falls within that category?
Both.
So how did they know that it fell within that category?
It's a good question. It's good and it's technical.
Very
But
interesting what you raised.
Yes.
But
that's what I'm saying. Remind me Purim time. We'll go through this in much bigger detail. But what becomes interesting is within all of this context, why does the story of Hanukkah still remain? All of the other days that celebrate Yom Tovs of the second Beis Hamikdash ceased to exist. Purim cannot cease to exist. Also, firstly, because it is written, it's on the books. You can't get rid of it. But secondly, it's also technically not a Yom Tov of the second Beis Hamikdash. It's not a day commemorating something that happened in the days of the second Beis Hamikdash. Hanukkah very much is. The story of Hanukkah is the Greeks came and they ransacked the temple, and then we fought against them and we won, and we rededicated the temple. Why is that story going to stick?
It's hard to answer it in the way that we want to, but it should stick, because what you just said about Purim, almost like using that makes you remember Amalek, so it's almost like an addendum to that. What's the addendum that Hanukkah seems its own? Like, it's not like we're already doing the Menorah, or right?
I'll make it worse for you. We'll pull this out of the Rambam. The Rambam.
it's not getting in under the Amalek law, right?
It's not, no, for sure not Amalek.
It's not Amalek. What's the mitzvah that it would drive into?
So right, so not only what's the mitzvah. I mean, Chazal can say we're going to make a din d'Rabbanan that this is what you have to do. A thing called Hanukkah. You can do that, but why? Why did they do that? Meaning, the Yom Tov of Hanukkah, as was instituted, it makes tremendous sense in the days of the second Beis Hamikdash. Meaning, after that story, and we'll see this in the Rambam, after the story, so it makes tremendous sense that the basin of the Hashmonaim, at that point in time, would institute a Yom Tov in gratitude to Hashem for saving them from the Greeks. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. The problem, however, is that without doubt, all of the work that was achieved during Hanukkah was undone by the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Meaning it was, yes, we won the war and we rededicated the temple, and then like 250-ish years later, the whole thing was destroyed. And we were sent back into Galus, much worse and much longer than the Babylonian exile. So the Rambam says as follows. It tells the story of what the Greeks were doing. It says, Yisrael al oivehem, and when the Jewish people succeeded to vanquish their enemies, ve'avdum, and get rid of them, b'chamisha ve'esrim b'chodesh Kislev, hi. It was on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which is coming up in a couple of week and a half time. V'nichnasu leheichal, and they went into the heichal. They went into the heichal is the building part of the Beis Hamikdash. There's the courtyard. That's the Chatzar the Azara, the courtyard. The heichal is the building, right? This part, right? That's that part. They went into the heichal. And they didn't find any pure oil in the Mikdash. They found one jug. And there was only enough to last for one day. And they ignited the lights of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. for 8 days, until they managed to crush olives and produce pure oil. Meaning, that's the Hanukkah story as we know it. Then says the Rambam, and because of this, his kinu chachamim sheba oisa hadar, the chachamim in that generation instituted, shiyu shmoinas hayom ha'elu, that these 8 days, shetchilasam, that the beginning of them, milel chamisha ve'esrim b'kislev, that begins on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, you may simcha, should be days of happiness, gladness, v'halal, and praise, meaning, and of saying halal, that is a mitzvah of Hanukkah, umadlikin bahem neros, and we light neros, we light candles, be'erev, at night, al pische habatim, on the, by the doors of our homes, b'chol layla v'layla, each night, mishmanas halelos, of these 8 nights, leharois v'legalois hanes, to display and to reveal the miracle. V'yomim elu hanikroim Chanukah, these days are referred to as Chanukah, v'hem asurim behesped v'tainis, and they are forbidden for a person in these days to say eulogies, to mourn, v'tainis, and to fast. Kimei hapurim, just like Purim, Purim and Shusha Purim, that's the days of Purim. V'adlakas neros bahem mitzvah midivrei sofrim kikriyas hamegillah, and the lighting of neros Chanukah has the status of mitzvah midivrei sofrim, of somewhere between rabbinically and prophetically instituted mitzvahs, kikriyas hamegillah, just like the obligation to read the Megillah. Good, makes tremendous sense that in the days of Hanukkah, they would have made the celebration. Why did it not disappear after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash? That's the question. That is the question. Meaning, what the Rambam says in Halacha Aleph, which we did not read, when he tells the story, the end of the story is, Vehemidu melech min ha-kohanim. They established a melech, a king, from amongst the Kohanim, because the Kohanim were the people that won the war, right? They were the ruling class. V'chazru malchus liYisrael, and sovereignty returned to the Jewish people, yeser al ma'asayim shana, for more than 200 years, ad ha'churban hasheni, until the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. So the Rambam is not shy about the fact that this lasted for only 200 years, until the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam doesn't explain here is, those 200 years were not good. Those were disastrous 200 years. Meaning shortly after the destruction of Greece, meaning we beat the Greek army in the story of Hanukkah. Shortly afterwards was the collapse of Greece and the beginning of Rome. And that Malchus Hashmonaim ended up becoming decrepit and corrupt and collaborating with the Romans and fighting with each other, to the point that anybody that says that they are Mibeis Hashmonaim, that they descend from the Hashmonaim, is Abda, they are slaves. And they sold themselves out and they became enslaved to the Romans. The Chazal are not kind to the story of the Hashmonaim. Like, it didn't work out well.
It was an illegal monarchy also.
What'd you say?
It was an illegal.
It was also an illegal monarchy. That's 100%. The Ramban makes that point in Parshas Vayechi. Deals with the whole question of Lo Yasur Shevet Me Yehuda, that kingship is supposed to be returned to the tribe of Judah. It's not supposed to be in the hands of the Kohanim. So it's true that the Jewish people had sovereignty, but with the wrong people in charge. None of this was disastrous for 200 years. And yet somehow or another, this became, I don't know, the most popular holiday in America. Yeah? That's so amongst Jews.
Yeah, but it doesn't fall evenly in its popularity. The rich irony being that the more secularized someone is, the more they celebrate the holiday that's about being very anti the secularized, Hellenized assimilated. It's very funny and rich irony.
So it is an irony, but I think that there's much more depth to that irony.
Sure.
There's a tremendous amount of depth. In order to begin to understand this, we'll begin with this week, and we'll continue Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach next week. The question, which is this pivotal question, is why does Hanukkah exist? That is the question. Now, there are two stories.
Why does it exist, or why is it maintained?
Meaning, why do we have Hilchos? I mean, why do we observe this thing called Chanukah? We don't observe any of the other Yom Tovim. None of the other Yom Tovim from the second Beis Hamikdash. Chanukah is the only one. This is, to a certain extent, there's a big debate amongst the Rishonim. What happened on Tisha B'Av in the days of the second Beis Hamikdash? Big discussion in the Rishonim. What did they do on Tisha B'Av? So this is an interesting question. It's machlokes. What did they do on Tisha B'Av? Did they fast because it wasn't quite like the first Beis Hamikdash, or did they celebrate because they had undone the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash? It's a big shaila. Machlokes, and there's. We're not going to get involved in this. Remind me another day. We'll talk about the history of like exactly what Tisha B'Av was in the second Beis Hamikdash. It's a big question. Okay. There are two pieces of poetry that the Jewish people have that detail the story of Chanukah, and specifically within the context of the Arba Malchios, of the four kingdoms. And the first of which is, well, probably the second of which is much more famous, is Maoz Tzur, right? Maoz Tzur Yeshua Selachana. I mean, that story of Maoz Tzur is telling the story of the four kingdoms. It starts with Paro, Chel Paro v'Chel Zara, Yad Gevim Tzula, that we were enslaved by the Egyptians and then they all drowned in the sea. And then Dvirka Cheyaviyani, Vigam Sham Lo Shagati, Vanagesh Viglani, Kizarim Abadi. That's the story of Bavel. We were exiled to Bavel. V'yein Ral Masachti, Kima Shavarti, Kate Bavel, Zeru Bavel, Kate Shirim Nashati. But 70 years later, we went back to Israel. It was Babylonian exile, and then sometime within that period is Kreis Kumas Berish Bikesh Hagogi ben Amdasa. Within that story, there was the story of Haman HaGogi, right? And what happened? Rav Banav V'Kinyanav Allah Eitz Talisa, that his children and his property, they all got strung up, they all got hanged on the tree. And then comes the story Yevanim Nikbatzu Alaya Azai B'Mei Chashmanim. They bashed through and they made all of the oil impure. Within all of that, there was a miracle that was done for the Shoshanim, which we'll probably have a chance to talk about a little bit later. Who are these Shoshanim? B'nai Bina Yemei Shmona Kovashir and which we'll have to explain why we're referring to people like that. We'll get there. That's one story. There's another story. We're also unclear exactly who wrote Maoz Tzur. Maoz Tzur, there's a few versions of it, but Maoz Tzur, I believe we do not have the author. Yeah, we don't know. Is written sometime in the 13th, maybe the 12th century. We don't know exactly who wrote Maoz Tzur. But there is another Zemer, which is sung far less commonly. Anybody here sing on Friday night, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom? No. So, Shalashida, sometimes we sing the second half of it. That starts B'vayim Me'edem Chametz Begadim. That's the end of it, or the second half of it. But this Zemer of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom was written by Reb Shimon HaGadol. Reb Shimon HaGadol was a contemporary, maybe even before Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGola. We're talking about the teachers of Rashi. So we're talking about like 900s in Ashkenaz. This is very early in terms of like liturgical poetry. Certainly that has survived. It also means that this is very, very well grounded, which means that there are some songs, some poems, some zmiros, some piyutim that you can make diukim on. You can pay close attention. Why does it use this word versus that word? And there's some that they weren't written with such care and consideration, right? Without such precision. There's certain svarim that require diukim, that you need to pay close attention to. Others that don't. Like for example, when Rosh Hashanah was here, a few weeks ago, Master Shabbos, he said, when you learn the Rambam, you have to pay close attention to every single word that the Rambam says. So the Rambam was a master at linguistics. Every single word that he said was calculated, was measured. So the Mishnah Berurah, you can't make the same calculations because the Mishnah Berurah was a team effort written by a group of different people that the Chavetz Chaim taught, and they all wrote in slightly different styles, and they were edited at different stages. So to make diukim, to pay attention closely to everything, to ask questions, how come he says this word and not that word, is not a good question in the Mishnah Berurah. Rabbi Lachman would say to us that the Masorah is that there are only 3 achronim, three later day saints, right? From the 1600s on, 1700s on, that you have to be medayik in every word, and that is the Gra. Every word that the Gra said was measured on the gun. Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and most recently was Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, because his children said about his sefer that this was the dam hatamtzis of their father, that this was like the lifeblood of their father. Every single word was written and then corrected and then edited and then rewritten, meaning the way that Reb Chaim would teach, would say over the Chidushim, he would tell his children to write it down, and then he would say, no, cross out that word, write that word instead. No, cross out that word, write that word. Meaning Reb Chaim was exceedingly medakdek in every single word, which is why you can make diukim in Reb Chaim, because he cared about every single word. So there's certain poems, there's certain zmiros that you can be exceedingly medakdek in. And those are the poetry of the Rishonim. You can learn a lot from what the Rishonim say. I'll give you just an example of halacha. There's a couple of halachas that come out of certain zmiros. It's going to come up in theory this year. The only fast day that ever falls out on a Friday is the only fast day. The only day that we will ever fast on a Friday is Yom Kippur never falls out on a Friday.
The short one.
It's a short one.
It's a short one.
The short one, the shortest one. It's coming up. It's coming up soon. Please God, it won't come up soon. Asar b'Tevis, the 10th day of Tevis. This year, the 10th day of Tevis is going to be on a Friday. It's only fast that it'll ever show up on a Friday. There is a opinion of the Abu Dram that says that if it would ever work out, and it won't work out like that in our calendar, the Abu Dram says that if it would work out that Asar b'Tevis would fall out on a Shabbos, you would fast it on Shabbos. You wouldn't push it off. And he says, because the pasuk says about Asar b'Tevis be'etzem hayom hazeh, that it's on that very day, as opposed to the other fast days, which are fasts that relate to the month. Asar b'Tevis is about that day, and were it to be that it fell out on that day, we would fast even on Shabbos. That's what the Abu Dram says. And some of the later Rishonim and Achram disagree with Abu Dram because of a poem of the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra wrote Zmiros, not just a commentary on Chumash, and one of the Zmiros that the Ibn Ezra wrote was Ki Shmera Shabbat, right? Ki Shmera Shabbat. So the Ibn Ezra writes in that Zemer, says that it's forbidden to fast. Asur levad miyom kippur avoni. It's forbidden to fast on Shabbos except for Yom Kippur. So they say that the Ibn Ezra clearly disagrees with Abu Dram, because he does not hold that if Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos, we fast. But if Asar b'Tevis falls out on a Shabbos, we would not fast. They say that there's a deal to be made. Meaning you can say, from the fact that the Ibn Ezra says that, it means that it's you're not allowed to fast. You're not allowed to fast on Shabbos, even if it would be Asar b'Tevis. So there's a lot more diukim, many halachas that we learn out of Zmiros. But the Zemer tells the story of the Arba Galios. Says Reb Shimon HaGadol in this poem, in the Zemer, Baruch Hashem Yam Yam, tells the story as follows: Utspir ha'izim higdil atzumov. The young buck became very strong. V'gam chazus arba alu limremav, and the vision of the 4 rose up to his heights. Uvelibam dimu lahashchis es richumav, and in their hearts they imagined to destroy those that Hashem is merciful towards. Al yidei kohanav miger miskaymimav, and through the Kohanim, Hashem pushed away their stronghold. Chazde Hashem ki lo yisomnu, quoting the pasuk, Chazde Hashem ki lo yisomnu, the kindness of Hashem did not end ki lo chalu rachamav, because his mercy endures. What is this talking about? What's the story? So I'll tell you, I'll regal achas, what the story is, and the next week we're going to need to explain this. Spir Ha'izim, the young buck, is Alexander the Great. In Tanakh, he is meaning in Chazal, he is the young buck.
Theodachi, his successor states, or is that?
Yes,
Oh.
the four that rose up
Yeah.
after him are the four generals that split up his kingdom.
Yeah, the Macedonians,
The Seleucids.
Turkey, like, are they the Phrygians? And then the Egyptians.
Right. Uvelibam dimu. Now you have to figure out. In their hearts, they imagined to destroy Es Rechumav, those that Hashem is merciful towards. Who's that?
Just the Jews?
That's us. That's us. Question number one is, why are we referred to as Rechumav? Meaning, nowhere else in the Zemer are the Jewish people referred to as Rechumav, the people that Hashem has Rachamim on. Specifically, Chanukah is about Rachamim, somehow or another. And then Al Yidei Kahanav, it was specifically through the Kahanim, somehow or another. Migerem is coming up that stronghold was shattered. Chazde Hashem, the kindness of Hashem, ki lo yisamnu, because they didn't end, ki lo chalu rachamav. Chazde Hashem ki lo yisamnu, the kindness of Hashem did not end, ki lo chalu rachamav, because his mercy endures. His mercy endures. Once again, the idea of mercy. Rachamim, specifically, with regards to Chanukah, meaning, what Rosh Shimon HaGadol is telling us here is that there is a story of Chanukah that is about mercy, and that is about Kohanim. Now, this Kohanim thing we mention a lot. Almost every text of Chanukah, we emphasize the fact that it was through the Kohanim. Like Al-Hanisim, right? Haner Salav Al Yidei Kanecha HaKadoshim, Chol Shmona Esrei Chanukah Haner Salav HaKadoshim. Meaning, Bimei Matisyu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. The fact that this was by Kohanim, which was illegal, which was awesome. They should not have taken the monarchy. It was wrong. They should not have been, they certainly afterwards should not have been the kings. Apparently, during the Chanukah story, it needed to be through Kohanim.
Is that like what you were referring to before with the Navi being able to suspend the operation of mitzvah?
Yes, potentially, but apparently the Chanukah story the victory could only have been achieved by Kohanim. Somehow or another. We emphasize the fact that this was Kohanim a lot. This is not something, the fact that it was something which was not supposed to continue, it was halachically inappropriate for it to continue, should be something that we would downplay during the story. But every single text, we seem to talk about the fact that there were Kohanim involved, which is strange. And then we refer to the fact that this is about Rachamim twice in the Zemer. I mean, what exactly is going on here? Because once we figure out what the Rishonim and what Chazal are referring to, we will have a little bit of an opening into why we celebrate Chanukah Day. Because again, the question is, the achievements of Chanukah were destroyed with the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, along with all of the other things in Megillas Taanis. And I'll leave you with this, just because it's worth knowing. There's a very famous question. This is known as the Beis Yosef's question. Somebody wrote a book a couple of years ago, 100 answers to the Beis Yosef question, and somebody else wrote a sequel to it, 1,000 answers to the Beis Yosef's question. What's the Beis Yosef's question? Why is Hanukkah 8 days? What should it be? 7 days. Why? Because they had enough oil for 1 day. Celebrate for 7 days. And there's 1,000 reasons plus. 1,000 reasons. The Megillas Taanis writes the simplest answer. And it seems to be that the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, did not have at least our text of the Megillas Taanis. The Megillas Taanis says exactly why. It says because it took 8 days to clean up. It was a mess. They littered, and it took 8 days to clean up. By the end of 8 days, they could finish the dedication. They got in there from day 1 to day 8. They were lighting the menorah. That was the day of rededicating. Hanukkah literally means Hanukkah's Mizbeach. They were rededicating the Mizbeach. It took 8 days to clean it. It was a big mess. It was a big mess. It was the cleanup party. During those 8 days, everybody was chipping in. They were cleaning up. They were rededicating the base. I mean, that's good. It took 8 days. That's what it took. And it seems to be the Megillah Taanis says, and those 8 days we've now consecrated as 8 days of stuff. But all of that was undone. Which means that celebrating Hanukkah today is somewhat anachronistic. It doesn't make sense. The achievement of Hanukkah was undone by the Romans. So, what exactly are we celebrating? But it's supposed to be continued next week. Thank you to all the Chevra that were joining us online.